side stream smoke and nitrosamines were harmful to health.
Objection, Your Honor. That's beyond the scope. There's no foundation or basis for this established record testifying on why women were not.
Well, at the time he was working for that.
At the time he was working.
My understanding is that Premier was designed to address a number of issues that they felt consumers may be interested in. One would be there are a number of constituents in mainstream smoke which the health effects community had been concerned about or had suggested were relevant to the smoking and health issue, and those constituents in mainstream smoke were significantly reduced. There was an ash issue. Some people complained apparently about ashes. They didn't like ashes. They thought cigarettes were messy, and that was also largely eliminated from Premier. Side stream smoke was an issue also that I think that people may have been concerned about, and that was also addressed. There were a number of issues that were potentially addressed, or at least that I believe R.J. Reynolds felt that consumers may have an interest in. There are a number of characteristics about the product that they felt consumers might be interested in.
Well, Reynolds has a database of consumers that call a toll-free number and express their concerns. And this is the kind of thing that Reynolds and all tobacco companies survey, isn't it?
Objection, Your Honor. There is no basis in the record for that statement. Counsel is testifying. It's well outside the scope.
It's not cross.
I don't have any knowledge or experience with what database Reynolds may have concerning its consumers.
Weren't you at one time the head or involved with consumer inquiries?
Not for R.J. Reynolds.
For Brown Williamson?
For Brown Williamson, not for the whole operation, but only for the part of the organization that R&D served. It wasn't the total consumer information.
R&D being research and development.
Correct.
Now, if the consumers were obviously, as I've understood what you said, the Premier cigarette, as any new cigarette, would, from the manufacturer's standpoint, they want to address the concerns of the consumer, of smokers. Correct?
Could you please restate that question?
Yeah, I mean, isn't one of the reasons that a lot of money was spent by Reynolds trying to develop the Premier cigarette, I thought you said was they were interested in addressing the concerns of consumers.
I believe what I said was they felt that the Premier product offered a number of attributes that consumers may be interested in. There might be market niches for. Among those were reduced side stream smoke, less ash, reduced constituents in mainstream smoke, certain constituents.
You would agree, would you not, that if consumers were interested in eliminating or greatly reducing secondhand smoke, that they had health concerns about secondhand smoke?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, but maybe.
It's certainly possible, but there could be a number of reasons why people might not want secondhand smoke to be generated from their cigarettes. I would think one of the biggest reasons might be just lack of annoyance of people around them.
You would agree with this statement, would you not, that cigarette smoking may kill people, it may not, we simply don't know?
I would agree with that.
Now, I want you to assume that every CEO of Philip Morris, Reynolds, Lorillard, and Brown Williamson said that both in 1993 in depositions under oath and in April of 1997, we don't know if cigarette smoking kills people. It may, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Wouldn't you agree that that is the party line of every tobacco company, as well as the Tobacco Institute and the Council for Tobacco Research, right up until this day?
Objection, Your Honor. Question.
Yeah. All right, let's sustain. It's not a resolution issue.
you would agree that side stream smoke contains a greater level of tobacco-specific nitrosamines than the mainstream smoke. Is that correct?
Side stream smoke does, but that's not what environmental tobacco smoke is. Environmental tobacco smoke is very different than side stream smoke because it's aged and diluted. In my view, what's relevant is what's actually in the air that people are breathing when smoking is being conducted, not what's in the plume of smoke coming off the lid end of the cigarette.
But what's coming off the lid end of the cigarette, the smoke that's coming off the lid end of the cigarette, contains a higher level of tobacco-specific nitrosamines than the mainstream smoke that the smoker is taking in.
Some of them, yes. But the actual concentrations in a room where people are smoking are exceedingly small, as I indicated yesterday.
Yeah, right, on your charts. And that's why secondhand smoke's not a problem for anybody, because your charts demonstrated that the amounts that anyone is exposed to is so tiny and so insignificant that it's not a health problem. Right?
Well, I don't think that's a fair characterization of my testimony. What I said was because the levels are so low in comparison to adverse effects that have been reported in animal studies, I cannot conclude that there's sufficient evidence based on the constituent toxicology that environmental tobacco smoke is a cause of disease in humans.
What is NDMA? One of your charts had that title.
N-nitrosodimethylamine.
Why did you not do a chart on the NNK nitrosamine?
Well, actually, I did do calculations on that, and I went through a similar analysis.
But you didn't do a chart?
No.
The NNK nitrosamine is a tobacco-specific nitrosamine, whereas the NDMA nitrosamine is contained in other substances as well, in other products as well. Correct?
Yeah, NDMA is present in outside air. It's been identified in food we eat, the air we breathe, and the water we drink. The analysis is the same, however. The levels of NNK in the air in rooms where smoking is occurring is extremely low, and the health effects are roughly comparable as tested in animal toxicity studies.
You gave up smoking, right? Used to be a smoker, you're not anymore.
That's correct.
And of course, you didn't give up smoking because you were worried about health. You gave it up for some other reason.
I gave it up for a lot of reasons.
And one of them was not health.
It was in my mind. It wasn't the primary reason.
Do I understand correctly that you agree with the surgeon, with the accuracy of the Surgeon General's warning, which says cigarette smoking causes lung cancer, heart disease, and emphysema? You agree with the accuracy of that from a public health standpoint?
And also from the context of the assessment criteria used to make that statement are based extensively on epidemiological evidence, or almost primarily on epidemiological evidence.
Without going through all of your charts, it's obvious that in terms of your charts, the amount of secondhand smoke that people are exposed to is very trivial.
Well, trivial is
Well, use your words.
It's not a scientific term. The levels of the constituents that I looked at, which were things that have been measured in the scientific literature, things that were measured in the Department of Transportation study, are relatively low when I compare them against a number of benchmarks, such as regulatory exposure standards or results of animal toxicity studies.
And every time a smoking ban is being discussed as a policy in any kind of public forum, the tobacco industry sends representatives to express that point of view, that because of the scientific evidence, the lack of scientific evidence which you've described, bans are not necessary, correct?
I don't have any knowledge about what the tobacco industry does when bans are being proposed in various contexts.
You don't have, Dr. Appleton, you don't have general knowledge of the fact that the tobacco industry always opposes bans, whether they're on airplanes, in buildings, in public facilities. You don't know about that.
No, I don't. That's not an area that I deal with in my job.
Have you ever thought about why smoking is banned in so many places all over the United States if what you say is true, that there's no scientific basis to justify the bans? You ever think about that?
Sure.
And what's your answer?
I think that there's been a tremendous amount of concern about smoking and health in general, active smoking and health in general, for the last 40 or 50 years. And I believe that a lot of the momentum built up about the concern about smoking and health has carried over into people's views about environmental tobacco smoke. And there's other aspects about environmental tobacco smoke. Smoke smells. Some people don't like that. And when it gets to high levels, it can be irritating, and some people don't like that. And I think people feel that that they just don't want smoke around, whether it's a scientifically based conclusion or if it's based on emotion. I don't know. I think there's a possibility for all kinds of reasons why people may not want smoke around and propose bans.
Now, you would agree that in terms of the performance bonus which you may get from Brown and Williamson, part of what will be taken into account is how you did on your deposition and how you did in testifying in court yesterday and today.
Your Honor,
that's part of the picture.
you've already
I
ruled
thought I
on this,
ruled.
and I think you ought
I agree.
to request the jury be instructed in this regard.
I don't have to request the jury to be sustain the objection.
Now let me ask you some questions about your responsibility. In addition to maintaining technical expertise, you have a responsibility of overseeing the research and development consumer inquiry for Brown and Williamson, right?
I did, but I don't now. But
What-
I did for about 18 months.
I believe at the time your deposition was taken, on June 12, you still did.
Yes.
So when did you give that up?
Really, it's been very recent, within the last 2 or 3 months. I
And
don't remember the exact.
Any particular reason?
No, mostly my understanding is that I was taking on more and more responsibilities in other areas, and also there was a manager in research and development who had previously managed the area who didn't have a full plate of responsibilities, and so it was just a shifting of priorities to balance out the workload.
Now, what was the policy when you were overseeing the research and development consumer inquiry? What was the policy of Brown and Williamson if a smoker called up and asked, am I presenting any possible health hazards to my loved ones if I smoke in their presence? What was the answer given to that question?
I don't know the answer. The part of the consumer inquiry area that we were involved in didn't develop answers that were transmitted to the public. We weren't involved in that. That's all done in Louisville. What we were involved in is analyzing samples that were in any way connected to a manufacturing defect. So it was more of an analytical role rather than a response to the public inquiry role.
To your knowledge, did Brown and Williamson have any mechanism where that kind of question would be answered in a straightforward, honest way?
Well, I mean, you've asked me a couple of questions rolled up into one. I believe that there was a mechanism for responding to inquiries. Whether or not they were, in somebody's judgment, straightforward or honest, I think that's up to the whoever to review
Do you know what the policy of Brown and Williamson was as to how they would answer that question? A smoker asks, am I endangering my loved ones who are not, you don't know?
I don't know how they would answer that
Okay.
question, no.
Now, as a matter of fact, on every package of Brown and Williamson cigarettes, there was a toll-free number whereby if a consumer wanted to call in and make a comment or ask a question, they could.
Yes.
Okay. And all of those inquiries went into a database.
I believe they did, yes.
And do you know whether that database was then used to communicate with Brown and Williamson customers?
Well, if you're asking me were communications made, I believe they were, but if you mean after the fact, after a consumer made the initial inquiry, their name went in the database, and then at some later date, I don't know.
Okay. I mean, some of the inquiries you would get is somebody would say that a cigarette made them sick. You've gotten that kind of inquiry, and that would go in the database.
That happened on occasion, yes.
How many more years do you think these issues are going to be researched on smoking and health? Do you just see it as an endless thing that will always be researched, or do you see a point in the future where the tobacco industry is going to say, enough?
I think your question is going to the very heart of the issue of what are the fundamental causes of cancer and heart disease and lung disease, and nobody knows that. And the National Institutes of Health of the United States and similar organizations in countries all over the world have been researching these issues for decades and spending hundreds of millions of dollars, and they don't know the answers to those questions. They're complex biomedical issues, and I don't know how long it's going to take to get the answers to these questions. But we're not the only ones in that position. Certainly, nobody knows the fundamental causes of these diseases.
But you would agree, you say nobody knows, but you would agree that the public health community, the MD, the medical doctors, the pulmonary specialists, the cancer specialists, they're all satisfied that the chief cause of lung cancer is cigarette smoking and exposure to environmental tobacco smoke. You don't accept that, but they know it.
Well, you just asked me two questions. One pertaining to active smoking and one pertaining to environmental tobacco
Well, answer them in any order you like.
Let me address the question on active smoking. I believe the scientific community, based on the epidemiological evidence, is convinced that smoking is a sufficiently strong risk factor that it's the primary cause of lung cancer. Now, I don't believe that they unanimously believe that exposure to environmental tobacco smoke is the principal cause of lung cancer.
So the research could go on another 43 years. And I use the word 43 because the Tobacco Industry Research Committee was formulated in 1954. So as far as you know, the research of the basic causes of these diseases associated with smoking could well go on for another 43 years.
I think the basic causes of these diseases associated with whatever it is causing them, whatever that might be, whether it be diet or pollution or stress or genetic makeup, whatever the cause, will go on for probably a long time. It's been going on for quite a while. All these different areas are being researched. No conclusive results by the tobacco industry or the National Institutes of Health or any other organization. These are very complex, long-term diseases with very complex issues, and unfortunately, it's not fully understood.
And because of these lack of conclusive results, as you put it, in practical terms, I guess it's okay to keep selling your product and for millions of Americans to keep smoking because it's a confusing area.
Well, we live in a free society that has made the decision collectively that if people want to have access to tobacco products and other things that may be harmful to them, then they should have access to those things, providing that they're adults and that they've been adequately warned. And that's the society that we're in. We've all collectively made that decision. It's not a tobacco industry conclusion.
Well, do you say it's an adequate warning to the American people and it's a responsible warning to the American people when in October 1997 the tobacco industry says, we don't know if cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. Maybe it does and maybe it doesn't.
Your Honor.
Is that a sufficient warning?
Your Honor, number one is argumentative, number two is repetitive. At least 7 or 8 questions along the same line.
Well, it's not really repetitive, but
And it's also an area,
preemption.
yes, sir.
Okay. I'll sustain it on that basis. Preemption. Preemption.
Well, I'd like to have a sidebar on that in question.
All right.
Ask about.
Your Honor, I've got to go to the bathroom.
Again?
Yeah.
Okay. You run out.
I'm sorry.
We'll stay.
Okay. This will be really quick.
Okay. Oh, they have to go? All right. Go ahead. Go ahead. No. If you're happy sitting there, that's fine.
Up enough of your time doing the sidebars. That brings us up to lunchtime. No, we're not really finished yet with this witness, and we still have some time to go, and it'd be more appropriate this time to take the break based upon the break in the testimony. So we'll take the lunch break at this point. 1:30, folks. Come back at 1:30. sir, that now that there's a lunch break, we cannot discuss your testimony with any of the lawyers. Yes, sir.
Your Honor, our next witness will be Robert Parrish. He's a radiation physicist. Plaintiffs have moved to preclude his testimony.
You can step down, sir.
I have a reply brief, Your Honor.
Yeah, would you please, because I've just scanned the other one. I didn't have a chance to digest it all, but I'll take a look at it.
Maybe we can take that back to lunch.
I guess it would be best, because I would like to read what you have in here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's see you at 1:30.
Yep.
Hey, Judge. Yeah, apparently we have a scheduling issue. I wasn't aware of it. There's some question about whether or not we're going to argue motions now and rather than finish this witness. I mean, the witnesses, huh? Yeah, that's what I would have thought.
Then I'll come back later. You'll call me when you're ready.
Yeah, I was thinking about it. Every time I turn around, I get new documents to look at and motions. And that's what I was saying, this case reminds me of an ocean voyage. And I'm getting motion sick.
Very clever.
Yeah,
Pretty salty.
that's too deep for me. Oh, we can go on and on. Okay. We really ought to finish the witness up before we do it.
What I'll do then is, Stan will call me then when,
Well, he said here about an hour.
Probably less, as I reviewed it over.
All right, so you've got less than an hour.
and you'll come here.
Where are you? You ran out.
We've got right over, well,
Oh, there you go.
we're not gonna, depending upon what occurred, right now, we don't have much.
Okay, so figure another half hour or 40 minutes or something like that.
We can,
You'll give me a call when it's done?
One more?
All right, are we ready to? All right. Okay, have a seat, Tom. I notice you don't have your clipboard, your pads. I guess Olga locked them up. Do you have the key to the?
Yeah.
is
Well,
it-
the cabinet? No.
Cabinet. Well, photographic memory. Remember everything we said. You have the pad sometime? All right, don't worry about it. They said they don't need it. As soon as Olga comes in, she'll get the. All right. I think we were still on Cross.
Shall I continue?
Yes, sir. Oh, it is open. Why don't you just wait till we distribute these things?
Okay. So if you-
Just pass them on down, that'd be all right. Everybody got one?
Get it.
All right, that's it.
You'll recall that you testified yesterday. You made certain calculations to determine the amount of nicotine as a marker of ETS in airline cabins when smoking was permitted. And I believe you further testified that you utilized an average concentration of nicotine of 2.1 micrograms per cubic meter. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That was, let me just show you the chart so we'll know exactly what we're talking about. Okay.
Yes.
That's where I'm at now. Now, I want you to assume that there has been testimony in this trial from Dr. Ogden of R.J. Reynolds and Dr. Jenkins of Oak Ridge Laboratories that the average concentration of nicotine was 25 micrograms per cubic meter pursuant to a study done by Dr. Ogden in 1989. Were you aware of that, the large difference between their number and your number?
No, I wasn't.
Your Honor.
No, let's go sign, Brian.
I assume you are familiar with a document or a book called The Chemistry of Environmental Tobacco Smoke, Composition and Measurement by Drs. Jenkins, Guerin, and Tompkins of the Center for Indoor Air Research.
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
Now, the Center for Indoor Air Research is funded by the tobacco industry, is it not?
Mostly, not entirely, but mostly, yes.
Now, may I hand this document to the witness, Judge?
Sir?
Now, I'm showing you, Dr. Appleton, a few pages from the Chemistry of Environmental Tobacco Smoke. For example, Table 7.2 at page 147. And tell me when you're there.
Yes.
Okay. And I believe Table 7.2 at page 147 reflects that in Dr. Ogden's study, a range of concentration of nicotine levels of up to 55.4 micrograms per cubic meter in an airline cabin.
Yes, I see that.
Okay. And in the book, there's another study by someone named Malmfors, a 1989 study, reflects ranges of up to 98 micrograms per cubic meter, with an average concentration of 41 and 32 micrograms per cubic meter.
Yes.
And then I would also direct your attention to Appendix 2 at page 266, which reflects those higher numbers as well.
Yes.
Now, you would agree that your average concentration of 2.1, which is on the top line, is dramatically different from those higher concentrations.
Yes, and there, in the Department of Transportation study that I relied on, they also found a range of numbers as well. What I relied on was the median, but also the reason why I relied on that study is it provided critical additional information that I needed to make this calculation, which I don't see in these tables. Namely, it made measurements in various parts of the aircraft. It made measurements in the smoking sections, and of course the numbers there were much higher. It made calculations in the non-smoking sections. The numbers there were very low, in fact, in many cases non-detectable. It also made measurements in the areas in between smoking and non-smoking, and that isn't reflected in these tables. I don't know where these measurements came from. They may have been the levels that were in smoking sections only. The other thing that the Department of Transportation study provided me that I needed to make an appropriate assessment was an assessment of the percentage of time a flight attendant may spend in those various areas, so I could make an estimate of what their average concentration would be. If they're spending their entire time sitting in a smoking section, their exposure would be very different than if they spent most of their time in the non-smoking section where the levels were very low. I can't get that information from these tables, but I could get that information from the Department of Transportation report.
So that's your explanation for the dramatic difference between 2.1 and the much higher numbers that I just read to you.
Well, it's a number of things. As I said, the numbers in the Department of Transportation report were also spanned a fairly wide range. But the numbers, what I took into account was the percentage of time spent in the various areas and the fact that sampling was done in various parts of the aircraft, not just one part. So that most likely explains the differences in numbers. It wasn't just one sample grabbed out of the air. It reflects the totality of distribution of environmental tobacco smoke components and the amount of time spent by a flight attendant in various parts of the aircraft where those components were, or were not, in the case of non-smoking sections.
Well, were these numbers in this tobacco-sponsored Center for Indoor Air Research factored in at all in reaching your 2.1?
I looked at all sorts of information, but ultimately I focused on the Department of Transportation study because in my view, it was the most comprehensive study that was done. It was done by a government or agency, and it provided additional critical information that I needed to make an appropriate calculation. Just picking a number out of a table like this, there's no way I can make a good calculation. I can make estimates, but my degree of confidence would be a lot lower than when I had more specific information that was available to me from the Department of Transportation report.
Well, I assume you know Ogden and Jenkins.
Yes.
They, like you, are PhDs who work for a tobacco company.
I don't know their credentials. I believe Jenkins works for the Oak Ridge Laboratory.
That's a Dr. Jenkins.
Well,
If he knows, I don't know.
But it's a mistake.
does Dr.
If he knows that that's wrong, he can so
Yeah,
state.
is it wrong? I'm wrong?
Well, my understanding is that Dr. Jenkins does not work for a tobacco company, but Dr. Ogden does. I don't even know what their credentials are either. I don't know if they have PhDs or not. They may.
Okay. Now, go to page 149, and I have a paragraph underscored there. I think it's underscored, which I want to read to you. Is there anything underscored on that page?
What is it, 149?
Page 149.
Yes.
Okay. Beginning with the
wait a
words,
second. No,
there.
I'm on 152 now. I'm not sure if I have 149 here. Oh, yeah.
The sentence beginning with the words, "There has been a good deal of investigation."
Right.
Okay. Let me read you that paragraph.
Okay.
There. Pardon me. I've got my own system. You'll find it. Yeah, I don't have that in front of me right now. I'm sorry.
1 second, I'll be right with you. I want you to know where you are. Page 148.
149.
I thought it
Well,
was.
maybe it's on the other side, 149.
Well, I think 149 is on the second half of the page.
Yeah, you're right. 149. In the middle of the second paragraph, it starts with the highest ambient, and then it starts with
Beginning-
"there has been a good deal."
There has been a good deal of investigation regarding nicotine levels in commercial aircraft, probably due to proposed and now enacted legislation designed to ban smoking on these conveyances. Typically, nicotine levels are greater in smoking than in non-smoking sections of the aircraft. However, substantial levels of nicotine have been reported in non-smoking sections. For example, in one study of 48 flights, nicotine levels averaged 22 micrograms per cubic meter in the tourist non-smoking section, and that came out in the Malfour study of 1989. This section was immediately behind the smoking seats of the business class cabin in a jet aircraft. Since a typical ventilation pattern is front to back, such a finding is not unexpected. So even in a non-smoking section, as reflected in page 149, they get 22 micrograms per cubic meter, and your chart has 2.1.
Well, let me make one small comment. You said 22. It says here 21 micrograms per cubic meter. But they say here that the non-smoking section that they identified was immediately behind the smoking section. That would have been comparable to the border section in the Department of Transportation study, which is actually quite close to the smoking section. It's not at all unusual. You would get levels higher in the section immediately next to the smoking section. The Department of Transportation study found that as well. But they also took samples in areas that were remote from the smoking sections, and there the levels were extremely low, and they also indicated that flight attendants spend the majority of their time in the remote sections of the aircraft. They spend some time in the border section, which would be indicated here, and they spend a relatively small percentage of their time in the smoking section because it's so small.
Isn't it a fact that you basically ignored that data so that in your chart you could come up with the lowest possible number? And isn't this number, in fact, as we've been through that, basically misleading?
Not at all. This is a government-sponsored study. the largest study of its kind, containing the greatest number of samples and the greatest number of aircraft. These are the numbers that this government study reported. This is a much larger study than this one, and it also was done in more detail and provided a more refined analysis.
So you have a lot of confidence in a government study when it's the Department of Transportation, but you don't have a lot of confidence in a government study when it comes from the Surgeon General of the United States or the Environmental Protection Agency.
It doesn't matter who's the originator of the study. What matters to me is how much samples were taken, how many details were given about where the sampling was done, what this represents in terms of locations in the aircraft, how much information is provided about where flight attendants spend most of their time. If that was a industry-sponsored study, then that's what I would have relied on. It didn't matter who sponsored the study. What matters is the way the study was conducted and the information it provides, and this happens to be the best study that's out there.
Look at page 152.
Yes.
The sentence that begins with, "The data suggest that exposure venues," are you there?
Yes.
Okay. Are you,
Sorry, now, what part of the page?
It's in the, no.
yeah, what column, what part?
Well, it's in the second paragraph from the top, the first full paragraph, and about
Okay.
the second sentence.
The data suggests that exposure venues can be classified into two broad categories, lower and higher exposure. The lower exposure venues include such situations as public buildings, restaurants, offices, and most work situations. The higher venues include smoking sections of transportation systems, designated smoking lounges, and bars and taverns. So at least in this book, sponsored by the Center for Indoor Air Research, they conclude that the higher venues of exposure to environmental tobacco smoke would include airplanes.
It doesn't say airplanes, it says transportation systems.
Do you question whether airlines would or would not fall within transportation systems, or you think maybe they weren't referring to
Well, I
airlines?
think it probably referred to many things, including automobiles, trains,
Right.
and airplanes. But from my view of the data, from the GeoMet study, the Department of Transportation study, in fact, the levels of RSP, CO, and nicotine were lower than levels that I had typically seen in places like offices or homes where smoking was occurring.
Now, I noticed that on your curriculum vitae, you've completed a course in media communications.
Yes.
What was that course all about?
It was a one-day course basically talking about how to be clear when you speak, how to not be ambiguous, how to identify what the main things are that you want to speak about and make sure that you present those things.
In what was the context? In what context are you communicating?
I'm not sure what the intended context was. I was just asked to attend this one-day course. It was when I was with R.J. Reynolds.
Where was the course held?
I believe New York City.
Is that this? Do you know whether that's the same course that Dr. Ogden and Dr. Coggins attended?
I have no idea.
Okay. Then another course you completed in negotiation skills. Tell us about that course.
Oh, that was so long ago. I think I was with Best Foods then. I don't really remember, but I think it may have had to do with negotiating contracts that we were involved with, basically laying out contracts for doing research with various institutions who were going to carry out research for us.
Now, you have done research jointly with BATCO, the parent company of Brown Williamson. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know if you mean me or if Brown Williamson has worked in coordination.
Both.
Yes, they've worked together doing research.
And that research would have been done here in America on the premises of Brown and Williamson? Some of it may have been done in England?
Depends upon the research.
Okay, but both would have applied depending upon the research. Some of it would have been done abroad, some of it would have been done here in the United States.
Yes, it depends upon what area we're talking about and who had the capabilities in terms of equipment or human resources.
Has Brown and Williamson or BATCO, to your knowledge, cooperated with other tobacco companies in connection with researching secondhand smoke issues?
I don't know if this is cooperation, but we're all members of the Center for Indoor Air Research. Center for Indoor Air Research researches a number of indoor air quality issues, including environmental tobacco smoke matters. But those research, that research is essentially contract research with outside investigators. Actually, let me clarify. It really is, to my knowledge, it's not even contract, it's grants, which is a different arrangement than a contract.
Now, I believe this is still part of your curriculum vitae. The first page talks about your professional experience, and it gives your different employments, Freeze and Freeze, Reynolds, Best Foods. And in connection with your duties at Reynolds, it says that you provided technical support to the law department, also as a company expert witness for technical and safety issues related to product ingredients and pesticides.
Yes.
Now, as you know, we were given a list of materials that you have apparently reviewed in connection with getting prepared to give testimony in this case. You've obviously seen that list, which your lawyers provided to us.
Yes.
For example, one of the publications is the United States Environmental Protection Agency report, correct?
Yes.
Then there's an article that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The authors were Glantz and Parmley, and the title of the article was Passive Smoking and Heart Disease, Mechanisms and Risk. The conclusion of that article, which appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association, was that there was an association and a relationship between exposure to passive smoke and certain kinds of heart disease. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
You refer to 3 articles by Dr. Hirayama of Japan. Now, you would agree that in all of his articles and in all of his research on non-smoking wives living with smoking husbands, he concluded that exposure to the smoke of the smoking husband greatly increased the risk of lung cancer in the non-smoking wife.
in the studies that I reviewed, he did draw a conclusion that there is an association between non-smoking spouses who live with a smoker and lung cancer.
Yeah,
Yes,
and
in the studies that I reviewed that he did, I don't know about all of his research, but in the ones that I reviewed, yes, he did draw that conclusion.
And you would agree that whether it was a scientist or a well-informed layman reading Hirayama's articles, that it would be fair for the reader to conclude, based on Hirayama's articles, that the reason why a non-smoking wife developed lung cancer was because of her long-time exposure to her husband's smoking.
Not necessarily. There are many differences between households where people are smoking and not smoking. And the fact of the matter is, in that study, actual exposure to environmental tobacco smoke was never measured. And so they used the surrogate of being married to a smoker under the assumption that people were being exposed to it. And also the study makes the assumption that other than having a smoker in the household versus non-smoking household, those are the only things different between the two households. But yet a recently published paper by Kuh and Kabat examined whether or not there in fact are differences between households where a smoker lives and doesn't. And they found substantial differences, mostly in the area of diet. And they also concluded that these dietary differences may very well account for the small association that seems to exist in some of these studies of non-smoking spouses with smoking spouses. And they even drew the conclusion that this seems to be at variance with the EPA report.
Be that as it may, Hirayama's conclusion, beginning in 1981, when he published his first study, was that the reason why these non-smoking wives developed lung cancer was because of their long-time exposure to their smoking husbands. That was his conclusion, wasn't it?
I believe it was, but I'd really need to see the paper to see the details of what he concluded. He may have acknowledged the association and said this gives, a direction to do further investigation, but I don't know if he came down with that specific of a conclusion. I'd have to review the paper again to be absolutely certain.
You also reviewed a paper by Dr. Trikopoulos, who is both at Harvard University and the University of Athens School of Medicine in Greece, and his article was on lung cancer and passive smoking, and you would agree that, generally speaking, he reached the same conclusions essentially as did Dr. Hirayama.
That there is a statistical association between being married to a smoker and incidence of disease?
Yes.
Yes, I believe he did come to that conclusion.
And more than that, the only explanation that Hirayama and Trikopoulos were satisfied to explain how a non-smoker developed lung cancer was their long-time exposure to their smoking spouse.
Well, again, in order to be able to answer that question, I'd have to be able to review the paper, because in many of these papers, they do acknowledge the possibility that confounding factors and study bias could contribute. Whether he did that in that paper, I don't know. And as you're flipping through there, you can see I have many, many papers in my files. You're talking about the ones that show associations. There's many studies that show absolutely no statistical association between presumed exposure to environmental tobacco smoke and occurrence of disease. That I take is multidisciplinary and includes many of the courses that medical people take.
That's a pretty simple question. Are you an MD or aren't?
Am I a medical doctor?
Yeah.
No, I'm not.
I understand the toxicologist takes a lot of science courses, but you're not an MD, right?
I don't treat people, no.
You've never treated a patient. You've never diagnosed or treated any condition in any human being, have you?
No, I have not.
When you were with Best Foods, your concern was ingredients and products such as peanut butter and mayonnaise.
Among other things, yes.
Do you know one way or the other when Congress was considering the ban of smoking on airplanes? You know, I assume they held hearings and they heard all points of view, including the tobacco industry point of view.
I don't have firsthand knowledge, but that is a common way that they proceed, is to hold hearings when they consider a matter like that.
And since there is a ban on airplanes of smoking, obviously they rejected the tobacco industry view, which was opposed to banning smoking on airplanes, correct?
Well, again, I don't have firsthand knowledge of that. I wasn't involved in the issues at the time that was happening.
Now, I believe yesterday you were talking about, at least I understood you to say, in addition, I know you were involved to a limited extent with Premier when you were with Reynolds, but in terms of product development at Brown and Williamson, were you also involved with trying to develop a new cigarette?
I'm not involved in the development aspect, but I am involved in providing technical guidance about various matters related to it.
And what cigarette was that?
Well, all their cigarettes.
I mean, does it have a name? Has Brown and Williamson tried to develop a new cigarette in the sense that Reynolds tried to develop a new cigarette that would be commercially successful called Premier?
Well, we're constantly developing new cigarettes. I'm not sure what you mean. You mean with a specific technical objective?
Yeah, a name. Was there a cigarette with a name like Premier had a name? I'm asking you, did Brown and Williamson ever get far enough in developing a new cigarette that got a name and that was marketed?
Okay, I'm not trying to be difficult, but when you say a new cigarette, we're always developing products that are competitive in the marketplace. We hope are competitive. If you mean, were we focused on developing a product that's responsive specifically to the smoking and health area, we've been researching that for decades, and we've used a variety of strategies, and we continue to do research in that area as well. We don't have a name for the product because there's no product on the market like that. But we've been looking at a number of strategies since the early 60s on how to make a product that responds to the issue, the smoking and health issue, in specific ways. The most practical thing we've done, because we've received encouragement from government to do this, is to reduce overall deliveries. And we have a number of products that are reduced in delivery, that are reduced tar cigarettes.
Let me see if I've understood what you've just said. That for years and years there have been strategies to respond to the smoking and health issue in terms of developing your cigarettes.
We have explored a number of alternative cigarette designs and recipes to address the smoking and health issue, and followed several strategies.
And one of the main strategies, I thought I heard you just say, has been to reduce the overall delivery, such as reducing the amount of tar.
That's essentially been the primary strategy that has received encouragement from the health authorities. And so that's what we've pursued, and it seemed like the most practical way to go, not knowing a lot about the complexities and what they mean in the overall smoking health issue. That seemed the most prudent way to go, and we have done that. We've developed a variety of products that are low in tar.
Is the lowest tar Brown and Williamson cigarette less hazardous than the highest tar Brown and Williamson cigarette?
There's no way for us to know that. We have, again, followed the encouragement of governments. We've reduced the tar. Whether or not that means a cigarette is safer or not, I can't say. No one knows. We don't make health claims about those cigarettes. And the reason why we don't know is because the criteria that I talked about yesterday are the criteria that have been recommended by the Surgeon General for making that assessment for those types of products. They're very scientifically rigorous. And when you apply those criteria, you don't know.
It's basically a game, isn't it? I mean, you reduce the tar, and you're saying you're addressing the smoking and health issue, and then when you're asked, well, okay, you've reduced the tar, great. Does that make the cigarette safer or less hazardous? You say, we don't know.
We have reduced tar primarily because that's the main encouragement we've received from the smoking and health authorities. From the public health community, they have unanimously said you ought to reduce the tar of your cigarettes. We've done that. Now that we've done that, the public health authorities don't tell us that means our cigarettes are safer. The scientific community can't say that means it's safer. When we take a look at the scientific criteria that I discussed and apply them, we can't draw that conclusion either. We don't know if they're safer or not. We do know they're reduced in tar delivery, as we've been encouraged to do by the public health authorities.
Well, isn't it a fact that the very number one encouragement you've received from the public health authorities is just not to sell cigarettes? Because the public health authorities are convinced that smoking causes cancer, kills 430,000 Americans every year.
I'm not aware of any public health official recommending that the cigarette companies don't sell cigarettes.
You're just aware of the fact that every Surgeon General, every public health official recommends to every smoker in the United States that for health reasons they should stop smoking. And if every consumer followed the directive of the public health community, Brown Williamson would be out of business, correct?
What I've heard the public health authorities say is that people are entitled to smoke if they wish to. They ought not to. They ought to be warned of the possible health effects, but no one has suggested keeping tobacco products out of the hands of consumers in a free society.
I'm not suggesting that any Surgeon General has said people with cigarettes, they should be forcibly taken away from them. Do you or do you not agree with the general proposition that without exception, every Surgeon General's report since 1964 and the public health consensus in this country is to tell every smoker that they should quit? That's the goal of the public health community, isn't it?
Yes, I would generally say that's representative of what they believe.
All right, redirect, please.
Dr. Appleton, Mr. Rosenblatt handed you a document which was an excerpt from the Chemistry of Environmental Tobacco Smoke. You have that?
Yes. Shall I identify the exhibit number?
If you would, please.
It's D-02716.
And on page 149, I believe it was, of my exhibit, now approach your arm.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
He had you read an excerpt from that,
Yes.
and it had to do with certain levels of nicotine on flights as measured in some studies, the Malfour study.
Right.
And then he stopped your reading at a particular point. I would like you to read the next sentence after this, the point at which Mr. Rosenblatt asked you to stop reading.
Okay. I may not get this completely right because it's blurred here because of the way the photocopy did, but I'll try my best.
This is a better copy.
Okay. It is clear for all but an extremely small number of cases that the levels of ambient nicotine never exceed the OSHA 8-hour time-weighted PEL of 500 micrograms per cubic meter. Typically, the levels are lower than this OSHA average by factors ranging from 25 to 50.
And who is OSHA?
OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration.
And what is a PEL?
That's a permissible exposure limit.
believe in connection with your cross-examination, a question was raised and a study was referred to, which I believe you described as a true Cabat study.
Yes.
Mark that for verification. I hand you this document that's marked for identification as Defendant's Exhibit Triple C. Ask you, is that the true Cabat study? That you referred to?
Yes.
And did that study address the issue of whether or not confounders, such as diet, could have accounted for or could account for the increased relative risk from passive smoking in connection with lung cancer that was found in the EPA report?
Yes, it addressed the issue of the fact that there's emerging evidence that the level of fat in the diet and the level of vegetables that one eats can have a significant influence on lung cancer development, and also the issue that many studies had shown that smokers are very different from non-smokers in their diet in general, not all cases, but in general, with respect to those dietary factors, smokers tending to have diets that tend to increase their risk of lung cancer. And this examined the issue of whether or not non-smokers who live with a smoker also share those same lifestyle and dietary habits. This study examined that and found that, in fact, they do, that namely non-smokers who live with smokers tend to eat diets higher in fat and lower in protective factors, all of which tend to push them in a direction of greater risk for lung cancer. And in this study, it concluded that their findings seem to be at variance with conclusions in the Environmental Protection Agency report concerning that matter.
And do you know whether, I believe it was Koo, or maybe it was Cabat,
Cabat.
one of the two were on the EPA Scientific Advisory Committee, weren't they?
Yes, Cabat was on the EPA Scientific Advisory Committee in connection with the generation of this report on ETS.
Okay. And I believe on cross-examination, Mr. Rosenblatt asked you about the appraisal of the HIPPO 1 and HIPPO 2 and referred you to Defendant's Exhibit D 14524. Recall that?
Yes.
And is that document that I just handed you, that exhibit number, is that the appraisal for the question?
Yes, it is.
And is that the appraisal that you testified was done to evaluate the scientific value or defects in the HIPPO report?
Yes, it is.
And I'll show you document marked for identification as D 14519. Is that the article by Maurice Sievers, who was also on the 1964 Surgeon General's Advisory Committee?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, I'd like to offer the evidence. Defendant's Exhibit D 14524, the appraisal of the HIPPO report. Defendant's Exhibit Triple C, the Koo-Cabat study. And Defendant's Exhibit D 14519, the Maurice Sievers article.
I'll need the report. All right, I guess we're going to make a recess anyway, so you might as well go ahead and go now. fact, let me just put a sticker on there so I'll know. Okay, this. Then just give it to the clerk.
Copy that on.
No, I better keep. Yeah, okay. All right, why don't we take a few minutes then? Okay. Yeah.
A little break, Judge?
Yeah.